And my distinct apologies for all of you out there. We haven't been doing Podcasters Row in a little bit because we've been always trying to get people right after the holidays to go ahead and reach out and have some appearances on the program, but I did a little bit more due diligence and I got some more wonderful folks that are hosting some great podcasts here on the Podcasters Row. And, today's guest is definitely it definitely fits into the role and is doing some great work. I'm really fascinated to go and talk to our guest. He is the founder and editor of a consortium of author interview podcast channels dedicated to public education. They've covered over 100 subjects, disciplines and genres, and they publish 70 to 100 episodes every week. That's real quality. Listen, there are a lot of books out there that are being pushed out on a regular basis, and to have this kind of platform is wonderful. And with me right now is the founder and editor of the New Books Network, Marshall Poe. Marshall, thanks for being on with us.
My pleasure.
So before I got on, I was making mention of the fact that some of the podcasting I've gotten to do production-wise, working with one of the networks we work here with at where I work at full-time is now it's called WMR.FM, but we call it webmasterradio.fm. And there were several shows during the latter part of the fall going into November every year that we got the relationship for over a decade to work with the folks at the Miami Book Fair. So I believe that's the largest book festival that is in the country right now, except for the one that's in Boston, I think, every year. I think it's the second largest. And we talked to a number of good people on all these shows. So, let me try to think of the names. Doris Kearns Goodwin, Tavis Smiley, Eric Bogosian. We just had wonderful people we brought on a regular basis. And whatever books were coming out at the time, we spoke with the authors who were putting out some great books out there that were going to be featured. Might even do a passage or two reading about it on stage. Now, of course, we hear about that all the time. Hell, that kind of subject is being talked about now, and you hear, even in movies, American Fiction, I just saw over the week, earlier this year, as one of those Oscar-nominated movies that is that part of the authors and what they have to go through, the process of promoting and what kind of books they put out there. And, just for even being looked at as award-winning or New York Times best-selling, those kind of areas. But to get a chance to go ahead and, if you can't go to the event and sit down and watch somebody doing a reading or go to an event, even the movie Argylle kind of played that same role as well. But to hear it in a podcast, Marshall, talk to me about the idea of where you had the connections and the wherewithal to create. It was the next thing was the podcast, but what was it you led up to that facilitated the podcast, made it possible, made it a necessity?
Yeah, I think it is a necessity. The short answer is I was a professor and I had written books. And the kinds of books that professors write don't usually get a lot of press. Travis Smiley's books get a lot of press, but the kind of books, I was a Russian historian, and these are kind of the fundament of our culture. They're called monographs, and they're usually kind of narrow books on narrow topics. Some of them are extraordinarily interesting. They take 10 years to produce, and they're usually published by university presses. And, a lot of what we know about the world comes out in these books. And there are 4,000 of them published every year, 4,000 monographs. And this was back in 2007. I had the feeling that news about these books and the incredible range of topics that were available to people just wasn't getting out. And I had been looking for a long time for a way to get the information and knowledge and wisdom trapped in these books. And I say trapped because they're in text. Most people don't know about these books. If they do know about them, they can't afford them. And even if they do afford them, then it takes a lot of time to read them. So they're relatively inconvenient for most people. So I was thinking about a way to get the professors and academics and researchers talking about these books so they could kind of boil down what's in them. And the purpose was simple. It was just public education, and that's all. I just wanted to facilitate a kind of connection between professors and researchers and the public. And so I started a podcast called New Books in History, where I interviewed a historian every week about their new book. Again, this is in 2007, just to figure out whether anybody would possibly listen. And it turns out they did.
Oh, yeah.
That there was quite a few people listened. And this was heartening. I was still a professor at the time. And so I did that for about 3 years. And what I noticed was that, first of all, the authors were very willing to devote to give their time. They want to talk about what they have researched. I also discovered that the technical skills required were not particularly daunting. So I could figure it out. So, I can remember in the first days of the New Books Network, this was a long time ago, I used to use Skype out to call people on their cell phones.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So
I don't miss that.
Yeah, I don't miss that either. So this is before the kind of technical revolution that occurred, within the last 6-7 years.
Right.
But again, people listened because they were interested in this material. And they were fresh voices talking about things that you could never hear about in the mainstream media. Never in a million years would you ever hear a professor talking about their book. And so I built New Books in History, and then I sort of discovered that the model that I used for New Books in History could be applied to other fields or disciplines. So New Books in African American Studies, New Books in Philosophy, mm-hmm. New Books in Sociology, New Books in Islamic Studies. And since I was an academic, I knew a lot of these people.
Let me ask you a quick question about how much, because there's so many studies being put out, so many books being put out, that I don't even know if there's really a proper count we can give from self-publishing or independent publishers about how many books are getting published on a regular basis. Talk to me about the filter that you have about which. You did a lot of requests that you just basically, have you gotten to the point where PR folks and media publicity and publishers already know we need to reach out to Marshall and his team now?
Yeah, no,
was it always that easy?
Initially it was not that easy because podcasting was very new and publishers were a little bit suspicious of it. But what I knew was the hosts on the New Books Network were also professors like me, and they were eager to talk to their colleagues about their books because, as a Russian historian, I was interested in Russian history. It's what I studied. It's what I wrote about. And so it was easy for me to reach out to other Russian historians who had new books and say, hey, you want to come on and talk about your book? Now, the filter is an interesting question. The filter is essentially scholarly books. And these are almost always published by university presses. Mm-hmm. Not always, but almost always. And when I mentioned that figure of about 4,000, that's about the number of scholarly books that university presses put out every year. It's a lot of books. Mm-hmm. But there are a lot of professors and a lot of professors who want to talk to their colleagues. And so what I did is I brought these people on and I said to them, if you pick the book, you're the expert, not me. I'm not an expert in Islamic studies. You are. You pick the book, record the interview, and then I'll do everything else. And that's essentially the way the New Books Network works, is that the hosts are volunteers, they're professors, they're interested in doing this work, and they pick the books that they cover, and then they record interviews with their colleagues, and I do all the post-production and publication and promotion. And so in that sense, the New Books Network is kind of crowdsourced, except the crowd is very specific. It's professors and researchers and graduate students. It's not just anybody off the street.
Well, you can follow a format on what they should be doing in terms of timing or what they should be covering in each interview.
Yeah, essentially what I tell them is this. We give them documentation. I say the purpose of a New Books Network interview is to have the author describe what they found in their research and said in their book. Full stop. That's it. It's not a review. It's not even really a discussion. What it is the author talking about what they again, found in their research and wrote in their book, so that if you're kind of interested in the topic, whatever it might be, a biography of Richard Nixon or something like this, then the author is going to boil it down for you. And that's what happens when they begin to speak, is that, of course, they wrote 100 or 200,000 word document about this topic, but they only have an hour. And so they're going to boil it down for you. And if you want, and this is kind of I think it's important, if you do listen to the interview and you want to know more, you can read the book. and so it doesn't stop there. It's not like a Wikipedia entry where you read the Wikipedia entry and there's no place to go. There's always a place to go on the New Books Network. You can buy the book or go to your library and get it and read the book if you're interested.
I want to talk about the audience that you are able to draw in for this podcast and on the series of podcasts you do, again, 70 to 100. every week. That's where we were at. Now, you had talked to Podcast Business Journal late last year, and you had mentioned how you had talked to the folks at NPR, which, by all accounts, they are one of the best producers of podcasts. And I even feel like I've said this on the air and various podcasts that, they could let the towers go. They could let their AM/FM signals go by the wayside, and I think they would be profitable just on podcasting because they have a way of, the way they program their programming and the audience you're able to go and draw. I would imagine that kind of an audience would be exactly the kind of audience that would be fitting where they would want to hear book reviews or hear from the authors that are putting out books that they're probably either buying or listening to or reading on a Kindle. So you talk about that they were explaining how they produce shows. They were talking about they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars investing in the 6-episode series. And you thought, how in the world are you ever going to get your money back? And you talk about those trade-offs. So we make a lot of them yourselves. And you talk about, the efficiency of being able to put this podcast out, which we've all learned now in podcasting, how much little we need to put on production costs, but we can still put out such a great quality product. I mean, I can tell you right now that compared to before pandemic, what I was doing in terms of doing it from an office or a studio and having like a whole setup, which we really were just kind of like overspending on different resources we really didn't need because we could just break it down. And part of it was just smoke and mirrors. We had to create the impression of a radio station. But now after pandemic, people don't even care about that when they hear a podcast anymore. It doesn't have to look like a radio show anymore. And on top of that, your audience, you realize that even with NPR, I mean, they figured out, okay, their series, that's how I got caught on the most serial. But after that, they have all their shows they do. There's still a radio format. They might repurpose or might do something fresh and organic for what they're doing. But what do you take from them? And is that kind of the audience that you're trying to reach, that whole dynamic?
Well, it is the audience we're trying to reach because we know that the NPR audience is very curious and very highly educated. And we've done listener surveys of the New Books Network audience, which is like 500,000 people. And they are very well educated and very curious people. But what I take from NPR essentially is not to do what they do.
Right.
Because I'm old, and you mentioned exactly the right two words, radio show. Serial is a radio show.
Correct.
It's not really a podcast. It doesn't take advantage of all of the things which make podcasting economical. For example, the typical NBN interview takes about $100 to produce and distribute. $100.
Wow.
Yeah. I know we're extremely efficient and very small, but that's astounding. And the point is not to produce radio shows because podcasting allows you to do something that has never been possible before in audio, and that is what I call narrowcasting. If you're interested to go back to Islamic studies, when I was a Russian historian, I was just interested in Russian history. That's all I read. I was the biggest geek in the world. My whole world was Russian history and Russian historians. NPR's never going to touch those people.
No.
Because they're producing radio shows, and they cost a fortune. So what we decided to do instead was kind of cut to the chase, use the economies which are inherent in podcasting. It can really be done very cheaply. I mean, for the first 8 years of the New Books Network, we had no revenue at all. None.
Right.
I essentially paid for all of it. But it didn't cost a fortune, and I had a day job, and it was a lot of work. But the point was that I learned how to do it very efficiently. And it wasn't hard, really, to do it very efficiently. You have an author talking, the author receives no money. You have a host talking, the host doesn't receive any money. You have me. At that time, I wasn't receiving any money. And eventually you have to come to the point where you have to make the thing sustainable, and that does mean revenue. And we do have revenue now to support the project. But the general mission has always been the same, and that is just public education. That's it. All we try to do is inform people about new books. And that's really at the forefront of the New Books Network. We don't do anything else. And we do it very efficiently, and we have to do it very efficiently because the audience for any one of these podcasts, we have like 150, is going to be pretty small by most metrics. Because, they're it's a big world. So there are actually a lot of people interested in Islamic studies. But it's not the same. We don't have to get the same kind of audiences for our podcasts as Wondery and NPR, because they're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars. We don't have to do that. And so we can cater to the interests of a small community of people. And that's remarkable. And that's really I always say that's the magic of podcasting, is that, that there are 6 pretty good podcasts about plumbing. Seriously, about plumbing.
Right.
Plumbers, that's a community of people. They can finally talk to one another. It's not that expensive, and that's great, right? But it's not radio. It's very different than radio. And so, I do make this strong distinction between radio shows and podcasts. Podcast is also a way to distribute something. And so NPR's radio shows are distributed as podcasts. Okay, great. That's fine.
And that's the part where I get where you're coming from. For me, I still believe that because of either when you were, obviously either growing up or before you got into podcasting, we took what we learned from radio because we were listened to a lot, or we might have participated in it ourselves. For me, it was about that. I still think when I produce podcasts today and the people we work with right now, I still feel the need to go ahead and make them give a radio presentation, only because of the part that I need to make sure that the audience has proper context for what they're listening to, that you think about a certain particular time frame, you're cognizant of what your audience is here for and why they're listening. So you need to make sure whatever questions you're going to ask is going to be relatable. It's going to be that you're not going to have a guest go into a tangent where they might get lost in conversation, get lost in translation as to what's being said. And also, you don't want to give up too much, because the purpose of the podcast is to get people to buy the book or to order the book, pre-order, whatever it is. There's part of that with radio that I always think that's got to be incorporated somewhat into podcasting. But podcasting, the delivery system, the way it's done, the openness of content we can have that other places can't do, I agree with you on.
Yeah, I mean, that's just it. It's really incredibly economical. And so we can go places and cover things that have never been covered in audio before. I mean, YouTube does a similar sort of thing for video. But, I'm old, and I remember when there was 3 television stations and what was on was what was on.
Right.
And that was it. And that's just not the case anymore. So, and you mentioned context, and context is important. The context, in my mind, is whatever context the audience brings to it. So to go back to Islamic studies, which are books about Islam, the audience for that already knows a lot about Islam. There's no question about it, or they would not be listening.
Right.
They're interested in this. So you don't really need a lot of context for it, because they're already interested in the topic. They already know about the topic. And similarly, at a much broader scale, if you produce a podcast episode about Donald Trump, well, everybody knows who that is.
Right.
You don't need to provide any context for that, because
Correct.
Similarly with these kind of very small, narrow niches, again, mine, Russian history, it sounds really obscure, but there are thousands of people interested in it. And so, somebody writes a new book in Russian history, we bring it to the attention of that audience that already brings a lot to the table. They already know some Russian history, and they're going to be interested to hear what the author has to contribute to whatever discussion they have going on in their head about Russian history.
But now, where the
results is public education. People get educated.
What I want to ask now is, because you've written books yourself. But so
yes,
fascinated with the fact that you actually do that. One of your first books was People Born to Slavery, Russia and Early Modern European Ethnography, 1476 to 1748, and Cornell University Press published it. And so one thing is that from the books you have to read, that you write, or if you're having someone on to talk about Islamic studies, you've kind of mentioned a few times, your everyday person might not be aware of what history's out there. And do they need to be coming in with a sound understanding of history so they can better understand before they even get to the book? Or do you feel like the books that you're showcasing, or the books that you've written yourself, that you're offering enough right there where you basically are the history book itself, that you can actually give a good sound history of whatever it is in Russian history or Islamic studies, so that the audience, when they're listening to the book or listen to a podcast, they're not gonna be completely lost. It's like,
right. Well, you make a good point. It sort of depends on the book and the field. Most of these books, like you mentioned, my first book, it was a contribution to a long tradition of Russian studies. It goes back hundreds of years. And so it spoke to other books in that field. It would be hard to imagine anybody just picking up that book and really understanding very much in it. You need to have some preparation before you could pick up a book like that and understand it. And this is completely appropriate for us because we do reach these small communities of people, they're not really that small, who are interested in these things. So, if you're listening to new books in African American studies, for example, and there's a book about W.E.B. Du Bois, you're probably already going to know who W.E.B. Du Bois is. And this is going to further inform what you know about W.E.B. Du Bois. And that's just what we want. It's not really, the New Books Network is not really a good place to start. You really have to bring something to it, I would say, in order to understand what's being said.
I want to ask you about another book that you actually wrote yourself, which kind of ties in. You're not just your interest in history, but also your interest in media itself. So there was a book you also wrote in 2010, A History of Communications, Media and Society from the Evolution of Speech to the Internet. Now, I have said it on another podcast I host called the Broadcasters Podcast. I have said this for years that we've had a digital disruption. So the internet has disrupted all traditional avenues, which is where every corporate media entity out there has struggled to keep up or to try to hold on to what they have held on to as, linear or just traditional services. So right now, network television to streaming, there's such a disconnect and such a divide right now that, for all these corporate companies, they want to be able to just make money. And they can't do it like they used to anymore. And the way that news is disseminated, corporate companies want to be able to they want to be able to filter out what news goes out there, what they want to be able to go and cover. They want to be able to have a kind of a hold on what they want to go and cover. Meanwhile, the internet, there are a lot of outlets and sources that are out there that will give us information, but no matter what, it's all created something where we have this broken system of media where, if you want to watch content, you have a couple different ways to watch. We have more content than ever. How much quality there is out there, I don't know. And as for news, I can't help but you have to decode everything that you read because you can't tell if it's actual just news, factual, or an opinion editorial.
Yeah, I think to go to the book, The History of Communications, one of the things I learned in writing that book is that essentially what the internet did is it made everybody a potential publisher. It used to be the case that if you wanted to have a radio show, you needed a radio station, a television station. If you wanted to make movies, you needed a movie studio. If you wanted to produce a newspaper, you needed a printing press. If you wanted to record audio, you needed a recording studio. Those are expensive things. And the internet makes it possible for everybody to do all of these things for almost nothing. And this is tremendously disruptive. It's one of the reasons the New Books Network exists. It's one of the reasons many podcasts exist, because if the barriers to entry, that is the cost of actual production and distribution, were high, we wouldn't be doing it. And that would be bad because in the case of the New Books Network, we get to cover all of these things, which are never covered by the mainstream press because it's too expensive. NPR cannot cover them. Mm-hmm. And that's fine. NPR does what NPR does, and it does very well. But there was a huge gap in the sense that there were lots of issues and topics and people who are not being covered in the media by the mainstream media because of the barriers to entry. It was simply too expensive to do it. But now it's not. And what the mainstream media is learning is they have to compete against everybody. Including the New Books Network.
Exactly. Well, because, if you got to ask yourself, what would be the infrastructure you could get if you were to do it like you used to before? You'd have to go and create, either a syndicated program or something brokered. You'd have to find somebody to give you the funding and the wherewithal to get this on all these different stations, find the right time slot, or go approach NPR or whatever other public radio outlets are out there and find a way to do it. But this is so much easier to distribute, and there's no one controlling it. Like the other thing is that, I talked on the same Broadcasters podcast about deregulation. And it was just a subject I wanted to talk about because a couple of weeks ago, the SEC chairman that was most responsible, Charles Ferris, who was with the Carter administration from 77 to 81, he opened the door to let companies now not have a cap on how many stations they could own or newspapers or whatever there was. It was the start of the ball rolling down the hill, and the snowball just started going and an avalanche came. And right now that's what's happened, is that it would be fine if we had if there were just not 4 companies or whatever now that run all the media there is in all these different places, that, it's they can't make money. There's some companies that have to continue to lay off. They keep spending more money into debt, or they hold on to too much debt, or, they micromanage everything down to the bone. Like corporate in media does not work well. It's not a system that really is meant for that. But what the internet provides is you have so many different voices, so much different content out there. They can't compete with it. And what they want to do instead is, with the internet, okay, say newspapers and magazines, they want to go to this whole issue of they can't make money on advertising anymore, but then they want to have a code put in place where, say, Meta and Google, let's start making you pay billions of dollars because you're taking the ad revenue from us. So in Australia, I forget what they call it now, but there's a particular media code, a publishing code.
Yeah.
And they want to do that here in the States. I know they've already tried to put bills written together, and they want to go up against the internet to try to control. And the same thing with TikTok, the chance that it could be banned. It's part of, if we can't play fair, or if we can't control the narrative, control the game, then we're going to stop something from doing it. Stop someone from doing it.
Well, there's no question that the internet has caused monumental shifts in professional journalism. Mm-hmm. And it is definitely the case. Actually, I'm old enough to remember how this ball got started rolling, and it was actually Craigslist, because newspapers used to receive a ton of money on classified ads, and Craigslist just gutted that revenue stream.
Sure.
And people don't even remember this anymore. But then you have, Meta and Google and the rest of them also eating ad dollars. This is bad for journalism. There's no question about it. I know journalists. I did work at the Atlantic magazine for 5 years. I kind of have been a journalist. And, there's no question that our republic needs good journalism. The question is how to pay for it. And I don't know the answer to that question. A lot of it is about trade-offs. The New Books Network is competing with the New York Times because you only have a finite amount of time and attention. Where are you going to spend it? Well, I hope you spend it on the New Books Network and not the New York Times.
Well, now here's the thing too: with the authors and the scholars who you speak with on a regular basis, you and the rotation of folks that are also fellow scholars hosting these programs. The people running these books, they're not just authors. I like to look at them as investigators. They're actually doing the research, the work, putting all this information together. Like, any newspaper or any other magazine, of course, you want to put out a 10,000-word article. Of course, you're going to want to put money into it in terms of either photography or who they have to go to, where they have to travel, all of that. And there's only so many publications that still do that. And if they do it, they do a really good job. But it doesn't make the kind of money it used to. Or that these corporate companies, they don't want to put the money in it. They don't want to invest in it anymore. But that's the biggest thing that I've seen in media. And I think that's the worst thing that's hurt right now. And I'll tell you this. So, and I'm apolitical in all my programming, but I know that what Catherine Herridge, the former CBS News reporter, also worked at Fox News, when they decided to go and make the move to not allow her to take her notes, whatever personal notes she had upon leaving that source, that's a corporate company saying, oh, we're going to control, we might have this information and we might suppress whatever you're going to be talking about on our air. But we're also not going to let you go ahead and report on what you found under our watch somewhere else.
Yeah. See, on the New Books Network, we have no problem like that. But you're absolutely right. The books that we deal with are the product of years of training. These people went to college and then went to graduate school. Mm. They learned languages. They learned all kinds of techniques, statistics, and the whole 9 yards. And, they're among the smartest people you're likely ever to meet. And then they spend 10 years researching the biography of W.E.B. Du Bois. Well, they probably have something to say because they spent, a cumulative 20 years thinking about it. And that's an amazing thing. So it is important to say that the things that you will hear on the New Books Network are deeply researched over periods of years. Now to go back to journalism for a second. Yeah, it's very tough for these big outlets now. I feel for them. I really do. And I don't know how the good journalism that we need is going to be paid for. This is it's an open question, and it's an important question.
Well, because part of what you're doing right now is you are providing a number of these books. I mean, if good journalists are out there and they're looking to go and report on certain stories where it could be with historical factors or just understanding the world. I mean, how much do we have right now? How much do we have right now of any news that actually talks about world news? Like, BBC does a great job of it, but we don't get that kind of access here. Like, okay, if we're hearing about anything around the world right now, Ukraine, Gaza, maybe that's it.
Yeah, well,
maybe Haiti
and on
now,
the New
but
Books
that's
Network,
about it.
yeah, on the New Books Network, we don't do that.
Right.
I mean, for example, we have a channel, New Books in African Studies. It's all about Africa. I mean, how often do you hear about Africa in the news? Well, not very often. That's because the gate is very narrow. But for us, New Books in African Studies is just about Africa.
But there's a lot of fascinating content.
Well, yeah, there are scholars that are working on it and have been for years. It's a vast tradition of people that know everything about Africa. And so if you go to New Books in African Studies, you're likely to learn something about Africa. And we don't discriminate on the basis of like the popularity of topics. So, we do have some channels that are more popular than others. We don't pay any attention to that. We don't favor the ones that are more popular because we treat all of the content more or less equally because we think it's of equal value. A little bit like a university would. You're not going to close a department probably because of low enrollments. It's still important. I studied something that was particularly obscure, but nonetheless, the universities felt it was important to have somebody that understood this stuff. And actually, in my case, it's interesting because you don't know when this stuff is going to be valuable. So I studied early modern Russia. And who cares? That's Russia between about 1400 and 1700. That's what I spent basically 20 years of my life studying. And, people might say, well, that's just irrelevant. Well, it was irrelevant until Vladimir Putin wrote an essay and gave a long speech about it. I don't know if you're aware of this.
Right.
But, suddenly it was important to have people like me and my colleagues who knew everything about this. And we were able to say about Putin's speech, well, he gets this wrong and he gets this right. And this is tendentious and this is bullshit. And this is, So, but without those people, you would never know. And so you'd have the truth by Vladimir Putin. And really, that's, part of the reason that we train these people to do these things that look obscure. But the fact of the matter is you're going to need them eventually.
Right.
Because something is going to come up. You don't know when you're going to need them. And Lord, I was as surprised as anybody when people started to call me asking me to fact check Vladimir Putin.
Oh my God.
Well, I was like,
wow.
Because I had been so irrelevant for so long that I didn't know. It's amazing. Like suddenly what I know is relevant. And it was relevant. And I wrote about it. And I was happy to help inform the discourse about, what Vladimir Putin thinks about Russian history and how, in some ways it's right, and in some ways it's wrong, and, what his take on it is from the point of view of an expert.
Marshall, I just think that people don't want to be dumbed down anymore. Media dumbs down everything, and I think we can't. I'm so tired of seeing content that I feel like an idiot after watching.
No, we don't do any of that. Right. No, these are PhDs talking to one another on a PhD level about stuff that is, serious, and they have invested time in researching. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it might seem a little bit, from the perspective of, what's on TikTok. Yeah. But if you're a curious person and you really want to learn, you'll invest the time to actually learn something about it. And we try to make that easy for people so that, you're probably not going to go read the new 600-page biography of W.E.B. Du Bois. That would take a lot of time.
Right.
But you can listen to the person who knows everything about W.E.B. Du Bois talk about it for an hour, and you're going to learn something. That's an easy entry point for you. And that's really the entire purpose of the New Books Network is to really unlock what these experts know so that the public can get it. And this is something that traditional media could never do. No way. There's just no way. I mean, there used to be something you may not remember this called Book TV. It was a TV station. It cost millions of dollars to run. It was streaming, of course. And Brian Lamb would get on and talk to some author. Inevitably, it was some author that was Doris Kearns Goodwin or somebody famous. Like we have, this is an interesting fact. I keep a list of famous people we've had on the NBN. We've published 22,000 episodes. So it's 22,000 interviews about every gosh darn thing. So I keep a list of famous people, right? There's 100 and some. We have them all the time. Their interviews don't do any better than anybody else's.
Right.
Because the audience that we're reaching doesn't really care if they're famous.
No.
What they care about is the topic. And so, whether a famous person wrote it, they don't care. What they want to know is about W.E.B. Du Bois. And if they've never heard of the author, they don't care. They just want to know that this author knows what they're talking about. And I can guarantee you that they do, right? Because they're probably a professor or a researcher at some institution you've heard of, and they've spent 20 years working on this topic. So yeah, we don't play the optimization game. We're like, we're going to favor this podcast over that podcast, or we're going to put a big bright light on this famous person. We don't do that. We're just interested in providing people with the wisdom and knowledge and understanding that comes in these books, whatever they're about.
Let me go to my radio presentation point. New Books Network. Website is newbooksnetwork.com. Lovely website. I like how you get to make, almost feels like an Audible site when you just look at all the different
it's
stories.
Hilarious you mentioned that, because we just did a redesign, and I told the people who were designing it, make it like Audible.
It does look like it. It looks good.
Because I use Audible all the time.
Oh, yeah.
I love audiobooks. Yeah.
Oh, my God, I got so many books in my library from them. It's incredible just to be. I just wish they had more selection, I guess, sometimes in what I want to talk about. But
and that's something that we're interested in too, is that I can see in the age of AI, I listen to a lot of audiobooks.
Right.
Hundreds, literally hundreds.
I get to the point where if it's a particular narrator that's doing the book, I have
I have a favorite narrator. I have favorite narrators too. Yeah, I do. And I've written them emails. I've said, hey, man, you are great.
I agree.
Yeah. And I can remember particular narrators that I just like. Richard Poe, he's one. He has my thoughts.
Oh yeah,
Richard Poe, he's great. So in any event, the thing is it's not that deep. It doesn't go into the scholarly literature. Like, you're not going to find many scholarly books on Audible.com. That's bad, right? Because it's much easier to listen to a book than read it. And so, one of the things I'd like to see the New Books Network do is, get into the business of producing audiobooks by scholars and researchers and professors. Now, of course, you'd have to have, AI could be important here, because these wizards might be able to produce something that, because, having Richard Poe read your book is going to be expensive because he's a professional and takes a lot of time. So you can't do it that way. You're going to have to find another way to do it.
Exactly.
And maybe AI is the way to do it. But I would love to see, a lot of scholarly books made into audiobooks so that people could take the time to listen to them. And there's also accessibility issues. There are people, who are sight impaired and they can't, it's bad that it's not available. And so one of the things that we pride ourselves on is that we try to make these books available to people who, are sight impaired. There's no Braille book. There's no audio book. So they get to get a little taste of the book that they would never get otherwise. That's a good thing.
Now, I want to ask you, what do you think about the fact that there is a different style where, obviously, like you said, you listen to a lot of audiobooks. I have done myself. By the way, Paul Costanzo is a guy I listen to quite a bit for narration. One of my favorite books I've actually listened to several times is Five Families, The Rise, Decline, and Resurgence of America's Most Powerful Mafia Empires.
I've heard this. I think I have heard this book.
Oh, my God. I can listen to it again and again. It's so good. That's a long book, by the way.
It is a long book.
33 hours right there. That's a marathon, but I can listen to that again and again. So well done. And you talked earlier about the celebrities, the famous people you already know that you've had on, which, but what about somebody that that you always wanted to go and speak to, and you were able to go and get? Like, what was the one?
Oh, I've
one guess. It was like, oh my God, I can't believe I got this person.
I've done this. I've listened to audiobooks, and then I liked the book so much that I said, I'm going to take a little time out of my day, because I don't do any interviewing anymore. I'm too busy with the business.
Right.
Because I just want to talk to them. Because I'm like, you wrote an amazing book. I have to talk to you.
Yeah.
Because and that's one of the privileges of doing this work, is that you get to talk to these incredibly bright people.
Okay.
I don't know about you, but I would rather talk to an incredibly bright person than, me. So I take the opportunity to talk to these incredibly bright people. And it's really a gift that I get to talk to them at all.
And I would imagine the respect to, the one thing I almost made a mistake of was there was a guest I remember we were talking about. And I remember it was somebody that wrote about the history of the Bee Gees, and it was for the Miami Book Fair. And I'd only skimmed through the book. I didn't get a chance to go through the whole read. Then again, if it was an audiobook, it would be much easier. But I've noticed a difference when I've read a book and I'm able to go and speak back and recall things from the book to go and talk to the author about, and the ones that I didn't. So how important is it that you want to be well-read, and how important is it that you've read the whole book before you have any guests go on New Books Network from you or one of your hosts?
Here's something I learned early on. I remember when I conducted my first interview in 2007. It was with a guy named Malcolm. What was his last name? He was a colleague of mine at the university. And I spent endless amounts of time taking notes and, preparing for the interview, and I had all these set questions. And, I spent hours and hours preparing for this interview. And then I asked him the first question, and he talked for 20 minutes.
Oh.
And that was fine. That was okay. And then I asked him the next question, another 20 minutes. And then the next question, another 20 minutes. And that's fine. That's what we want. We want them talking about what they have researched and written. And so what I learned is that the authors do all the talking, and that's what you want. You don't, I always tell hosts on the NBN, stay out of the way.
Right.
Let the guests go where they want to go, because these are people generally who speak for a living. They're teachers, most of them. And so they speak well. And trust me, they know the material because they just wrote a book. So they know everything about it. And so if they talk for 20 minutes, great. That's what we want them to do. Stay out of the way. Ask a short question and let them go. Because it's not a discussion, and it's not a review. It's just an opportunity for the author to talk about what they wrote in their book. And believe me, they can do that in spades.
Yeah, and I noticed that that's exactly how the hosts on the podcast for New Books Network, that's exactly what they do. Because if I go through and listen through an episode, that author's getting all that airtime. They're getting the chance to going to be the focus.
They're going to get 95% of the airtime.
Right.
That's exactly what we want. We don't want, we're apolitical too. We don't do politics.
Right.
We don't do discussion. We don't do reviews. It's really informational in a sense. We just want you to know what the author thinks and about the topic. It's very narrow in that way. And it's not fighty. We don't yell at each other.
No.
We don't do any of that stuff. We just tell you what the author, we have the author tell you what the author knows, because they are the star of the show and their book is the thing featured. And so if it's 95% them, I'm really happy about that.
Right. You love books. You can also tell there's a passion behind the fact that you're reading these authors. You get a chance to go and talk to them in real time. You love books. And I love the fact that this is put together. The website is like a repository, a reference. I mean, it's like, okay, if you're not going to the library, then go to New Books Network, go read about these, and go learn about somebody that you want to read a book about.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned this, because when I founded the New Books Network, I had written an article for the Atlantic magazine about the origins of Wikipedia, which is fascinating, by the way. And I realized the value of crowdsourcing, of having people who just want to do this, because, Wikipedia editors, they don't get paid.
No.
Who just want to do this, and finding those people that are willing to devote their time to a public education project. And so I sometimes think of the New Books Network as a kind of Wikipedia in audio.
Oh, yeah.
Because with 22,000 episodes, you're going to find something you're interested in. There's no question about it. And, you may listen to the author and you may say, I disagree with the author, or I like it, I don't like it, whatever, but you've learned something, right? And it only took an hour, and you did it while you were washing dishes. That's pretty convenient.
Right. That's something crazy. I'm running out of time. I got to get to another call, but I really appreciate you, Marshall, coming on with us. New Books Network, again, is the website. And real quick for yourself, are there any other books you have right now that you're in the works on right now? I mean, what can you tell me about what you're doing so far in terms of what you have for yourself? Are you penning anything else in the upcoming future?
I haven't, I've actually been writing quite a bit, but I've kind of taken a step back from that, because it takes too much time to run the business. Mm-hmm. And that's a whole other side of it that we didn't get into, is how to make it pay for itself, because that is, that's a challenge.
Right. But the one thing is that it's not like there's a short of books that people can go and find out.
No.
For you.
Oh, no, not at all.
Like if you go to Audible itself, or you want to go to the Amazon, you have them all out there. And I also noticed that you have quite a few things that you've also even done the voice narration yourself. So, I mean, there's a lot there. And also you look for New Books Network also in terms of what information is out there. But first and foremost, newbooksnetwork.com. And you're telling me that you really still do as much content as you do every week and every month.
Yeah, we do about 70. We try to do 70 a week. But it's a big world. There are lots of professors and lots of books, and there's a lot to learn. And this is what really differentiates us from like the mainstream media, where you're going to hear about Donald Trump and Joe Biden all the time. That's not what you're going to hear about on the New Books Network. You're going to learn something you might not know. I think that's good for personal development. And so, it is. It's a place to go and learn things, and like Wikipedia is. And if you're interested in W.E.B. Du Bois again, you just go type W.E.B. Du Bois in the search window and you're going to find somebody talking about W.E.B. Du Bois. And that person is going to be an expert. So, in that way, it is kind of Wikipedia-like.
Right. Now, I also noticed that you have a book promotion service, and I noticed the PR company that you have to deal with right now, RLM PR. I've dealt with them actually personally on a number of guests we've had on for the networks I've worked over here. So I'm very familiar with their team. They're very good and very solid.
Yeah, well, this is another thing we're interested in. We just started this, and because one of the difficulties that all academic and authors have is getting word out about their books. They're always frustrated that they write, they spend all this time writing this book and then crickets, nothing. And so we've teamed up with RLM to provide affordable, and that's really the important, affordable promotional services for academic authors, because this does not exist. And, I know I've experienced this myself, that I publish a book and then nothing. How do I promote it? They say, well, hire a publicist. Well, that's $14,000 a month.
Oh.
And that for an academic on a kind of small salary, that's just not possible.
No.
So what we're trying to do is create a product, a set of services for authors that's more reasonably priced and kind of guarantees that word will get out about their book. And this is something that doesn't exist in the marketplace. And I felt it myself. So I hope that succeeds.
Exactly. Again, Marshall Poe, founder, editor-in-chief of New Books Network. Again, website is newbooksnetwork.com. And really, thank you for taking time to talk to us. I really appreciate it. I was fascinated by what you brought here. And thanks for putting all this information out there to everyone out there, because this is very important, and more people continue to keep reading books. Some of the best investigated, the best research, the best intentions, and the best information in mind. I really appreciate you taking time out to talk to us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And folks, that is going to do it for Podcasters Row. Again, all past episodes you can find at kingofpodcasts.com. And we'll talk to you next time.